Okay, episode 6 on this Project Raider behind me. Another fairly uneventful week. I didn't get a whole lot done, although I did spend some time out here. We have quite a few parts that are on order, and those are starting to come in, so we'll make some progress over the next week. Had a chance to work on the brakes, pulled the master cylinder and the drum off of the car to fix a leak and to test the drum. You can see it right here. So you can see here I'm working on the master cylinder. I can buy one of these remanufactured online for about 50 bucks, but I'm trying to see if I can just fix it myself for cheaper. I pulled out the pistons. This one is the bottom piston all the way down at the bottom. This one right here is at the top. And the worn out parts are these little rubber discs that seal against the cylinder wall right here. And what has happened is these have rusted up a little bit, and it becomes abrasive against the edge of these seals, and it leaks past. So all I really need to do is hone this out with one of these tools right here. It's a small honing tool. You put them into your drill bit, and you make the walls of that cylinder smooth again, and then you replace these little rubber parts. Well, so far I've only found these online in a kit for about 50 bucks, which is kind of silly because I only need 4 of them. 2 here, 2 here. So what I've done after I honed out this master cylinder was I took the pistons and I'm just switching the O-rings around. The O-rings and the piston in the back was in great shape, had no pitting or rust or anything on the in the cylinder walls. The one in the front had some rust right around where it was leaking, and that front piston seal was riding across that rough patch, and that's why it was leaking. So I'm going to switch the seals back and forth, putting a good seal up front with a new smooth bore. It should be fine as far as leaking goes. And then once I get a kit, I'll fix it for real next time. If it doesn't leak, then I'll just leave it. Okay, we have this master cylinder put back together. I'm reasonably confident that that front seal is going to hold. It's perfectly smooth in there, and the 2 seals up front are in good condition. So before I put this back in the car, the last thing I'm going to test is the low fluid sensor right here. And I'm just going to hook this up to continuity to this multimeter and check for continuity. First thing I'll do is I'll just touch them and see if it beeps. And then I'll do it again with the sensor in the up position. Okay, so this sensor here that alerts you to low fluid level is working fine. So this is ready to be put back on the car. The last thing I'll do before I put the brakes back together is to test the brake booster. Okay, well I just tested this drum, and what I did, the first thing I did was I put vacuum on this hose into this drum and let it set for 1 minute and unscrewed it to see if there was still vacuum, and there was. So this is holding vacuum. The second thing I did was I checked for any oil that was in there. I removed this seal, looked inside, it's clean, there's no oil, no brake fluid was sucked in. The third thing I did was I hooked it up to the vacuum on the pickup back here and operated the mechanism just with my finger force, and it works fine in both directions. You want to make sure the valve inside still works, and that when you push it this way, it doesn't stay in that direction, but the spring needs to push it back. There's a release valve inside there. So all three things worked. It's not leaking, it's holding a vacuum, it works fine in both directions, so this drum is good to be put back on the car. Spent some time working on the engine, had an air conditioner bracket come in. I ordered that off of eBay, surprised I found one. I'm going to get this air conditioning unit working on this car. So I ordered the bracket and put that on. Okay, I ordered in a bunch of parts this week. One of them was the AC bracket. I'm going to put the AC back on this car, and it requires a bracket that sits right in here. AC pump sits here, and the alternator gets moved down and rides off of that surface. Also includes a belt tensioner for the AC belt. It's right about there. Runs that circuit. So after attaching this bracket for the AC, it changed the measurements of some of the bolts. So I had to run down to the auto parts store and pick up different size mounting bolts for this bracket. Alright, we're working on this AC pulley tensioner bearing. It sounded a little bit dry when it showed up, so I took off the bearing cover, the seal, to expose the bearing inside. Cleaned it out with some brake cleaner to make sure it was clean of any debris, and then repacked it with grease, and now it seems to sound a lot smoother and a lot tighter. So we'll button this up and put it on the motor. So before I can put the oil pan on this motor, I have to put the rear main seal on. This rear main seal attaches to the block back here and wraps that crank. And that new seal will be pushed into this housing. But then I also noticed that I've misplaced the oil slinger, or it's called an oil separator. It's essentially a ring, a metal ring that fits on the inside of this seal, and it keeps off some of the oil pressure from hitting that seal, apparently. I've stuck it somewhere in the garage here. I remember cleaning it a couple weeks ago, and I set it down. I can't find it. So after spending a couple of hours looking for it, I decided just to order a new one. It's about $4, so that's going to add a few days to getting this oil pan put on. We're really just waiting to put the rear main seal in, the oil pan on, and then I can put this motor back in the engine bay here. Now there is a couple of things I'm going to fix before the motor goes in. Like I mentioned, I'm going to figure out why we have a small transmission oil leak. I ordered an O-ring for this front pump, and I have to get close. I have to get in there with the flashlight and determine where the oil is coming from. If it's coming out of one of those bolts on the pump, then I can just deal with that bolt. I don't have to pull the pump. But if it's the O-ring, the whole pump has to come out. So I'm gonna have to figure that out before the motor goes back in. Spent a little bit of time working on the transmission. I'm suspecting that a couple of those transmission pump bolts are leaking, and it looks like they put the wrong bolts on this. Whoever was in this transmission before me, they put a smaller bolt head and gooped it with some silicone, and then they ground off the heads so that the torque converter wouldn't touch the bolt heads. So I got to get in there and figure out what's going on with that. Spent some time tonight working on the suspension, cleaning it up, pulling out the shocks, pulling the brakes off. Ordered some brake parts yesterday. We ordered the rotors and some brake hoses, a few other odds and ends, and those are starting to come in, so we'll put the suspension back together this week also. So I began working on cleaning the front suspension components and decided to take a closer look at the brakes. I had initially thought they were probably fine and I could worry about them later. But I noticed that the pads were getting fairly thin. They're getting real close to the squeak bar, that safety bar that makes the brakes squeak when they get really low. And I also noticed there was a missing bolt that held on the caliper right here. So I decided to go ahead and just take them apart and put new pads on, which of course requires getting the rotors turned. Now the rotors have a minimum. You can see it right in here. It'll say a minimum of 20.4 millimeters. And so I will measure these to see if there's enough meat on the rotors to be turned. Otherwise I'll just buy some new ones. And then of course, the closer I look, there's some rubber components on these ball joints that are broken. You can see here that grease is able to escape and sand and dirt can get in. So I may have to replace these. I know that they're pretty burly ball joints on this car, and you can probably just re-grease them and they'd be good for a while. However, that's pretty bad as far as not protecting the ball joint. So I'm gonna have to take a closer look at that. So I ordered a bunch of parts for the suspension today, shocks, and a number of seals and brake items. I noticed that these brake lines are looking a bit bad. You can see here that there's some moisture coming out of the top of this brake line right here, So I'm a big proponent of just having good brakes, so we're going to go ahead and replace those as well. You can see some moisture right there on that brake hose. So, you know, as usual, it's snowballing a little bit, and instead of just cleaning up the suspension and driving it, I'm going to go ahead and replace some of these parts. That's going to add some time to this project. Alright, I'm working on cleaning up the suspension tonight, removed the shock absorber, and disconnected this steering linkage right here because the rubber seal on the ball joint is broke, and at the very least I have to replace the seal. Maybe I'll replace the ball joint if it needs it. But the easiest way to do that is you just heat this part up with a torch for a couple minutes and then tap straight down, and they usually come out pretty good. If you use the fork to pry it out, sometimes it'll damage the area, so I don't like using the fork very often. And next I'm just going to scrub this entire area and make it clean, and replacing the brake lines that were attached here because they're starting to leak at a couple of the ends, and they're pretty hard and rigid, and they could crack if not careful. So, working on the suspension, brake parts are coming in the next few days, and we'll get this button back up fairly soon. Alright, we are putting in the brake booster, and you can see here that the 4 bolts we are putting on are 2 on this side and 2 on this side, and then we will attach the arm to the pedal with a pin. With this pin. So that's what we're working on right now. Alright, we have the brake booster in right here. Next we're going to put the brake master cylinder on. And as you can see here, I've installed the brake booster and the master cylinder. I've tested both of them, they both work fine. And one step closer to having this thing wrapped up. So not a whole lot to report on this project this week, but I wanted to get a video up to show that we were making a little bit of progress, and we'll catch you next week. Bye.